Well, good evening. I want to thank you for joining us for this week's Breaking Ground. As always, if you have any prayer requests or anything you'd like for us to join together with you in prayer for, we invite you to drop those in the comment section below, or you can send us a message directly here on Facebook. No matter how big you might think your prayer request is, no matter how small you might think it is, we want to join together with you in prayer, believing that God can answer your request right here and right now. So this week we're continuing our study through the book of Jonah. And last week we started with chapter 1. And the book of Jonah, it's a story that probably most of us have heard at some point or another in our life. But most of us know it as a big fish story. But the interesting thing about the story of Jonah is that it's more than just a fish story. In fact, I would argue that the story of Jonah is the story about you and I. It's how we run from God. It's how we struggle with what God tells us to do sometimes. And it's about how we have difficulties extending grace, the same way that grace has been extended to us by God. Last week we walked through chapter 1 of this book, and in it we saw a prophet named Jonah who received a word from the Lord calling him to go to a city named Nineveh and tell them to repent. The problem with this command of the Lord was that it was to go to this town called Nineveh, and Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians were the enemies of Israel. So Jonah says, nope, I'm not going to go tell those people to repent. So I'm getting on the first ship that I can to sail as far away as possible. So he gets on this ship to a place called Tarshish. And in the middle of this trip, a storm, it threatens the ship. And Jonah finds himself asleep at the bottom of this boat. And while the rest of the crew, while they're panicking, while they're crying out to their own gods to stop this from happening, Jonah's asleep in the bottom of the boat. So eventually, they go down and they wake up Jonah. And Jonah says, well, the reason that this storm came upon us is because I was disobedient to my God. I'm a Hebrew. I serve the true God. And in that moment, he tells them to throw him overboard. Because if he's thrown overboard, he says the storm will stop. So these men, they come up to Jonah. They throw him overboard. And immediately the storm stops. So we might think that Jonah was apt to probably drown, to be caught up in the sea. But God sends a great big fish his way to swallow him up. And with that, we come to chapter 2 of this book. So last week, I asked you to reflect on 3 questions. The first was, how do you see yourself in Jonah? The second is, have you ever ran from something you knew God wanted you to do? And if you have, how did it work out for you in the end? And the third was, has something ever come your way that, though you thought it was a curse at first, looking back in reality, it was a blessing? So I hope that you had time to reflect on those questions over this past week. And if not, why not just take a few moments now, pause the video, and reflect on them yourself before catching up with the rest of this video. So chapter 2 of the book of Jonah picks up with Jonah finding himself in the belly of this great fish. And the most interesting thing about this chapter, in my opinion, is that this is when Jonah finally begins to pray. Because verse 1 of Jonah 2, it says that Jonah began to pray. It says, then Jonah began to pray. You see, the calling to go to Nineveh, it didn't cost Jonah to pray. Being caught up in the storm in the middle of the Mediterranean, it didn't cause Jonah to pray. Being thrown overboard into the tossing and turning waves didn't cause Jonah to pray. But finally, when Jonah finds himself in the belly of this great fish, it's then that Jonah begins to pray. And it's amazing that we go through so many different things in life before we're finally driven to prayer. And I wonder why that is. I wonder why it takes a certain level of anxiety, a certain level of trouble, a certain level of uncertainty to finally come into our lives, and then to us to take time and stop to say, all right, God, I finally need your help now. I know I went through all of that stuff, all of that chaos that was in my life, but now it's time for me to call out onto you for help. I know I didn't act like I needed your help before, but time and time again, I should have, and now I really need your help. So in the middle of all these calamities that came upon Jonah, God finally got his attention by calling upon this great fish to swallow up Jonah. And I think that the fish finally provoked Jonah to prayer because he realized that this fish was actually provision. Because as we read through this prayer that Jonah cries out to the Lord in, we find that it's a prayer of thanksgiving. And what an incredible prayer for a man who's stuck in the middle of a fish's belly to cry out to the Lord, right? In the middle of all of this, Jonah prays, he calls out to the Lord, and he thanks him. And I wonder if this has to do with the fact that Jonah realizes that God could have left him drown. He could have left him flounder, no pun intended there in the sea. He could have left him to die in the middle of that great, vast Mediterranean Sea. But God sent a fish his way to swallow him up and save him. When things happen in our life, we may not always think of them as being God's provision. Have you ever looked back on something that may have caused you problems? But looking back, you see that a bad thing kept you from something much worse. You see, something that looks bad can save us from things that are far much worse. The things that appear bad save us from things that are far more awful. And that's where Jonah is. He realizes that the fish saved him from death. And that's what's even more amazing is that Jonah prays this prayer of thanksgiving in expectation of deliverance. You see, Jonah, when you get to verse 6 of chapter 2, he says, "Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." So from the pit of a fish's stomach, Jonah declares that God will bring him to life. This was a prayer of faith and expectation. It wasn't a prayer of woe is me. It wasn't a prayer of mourning, of sorrow. It was a prayer of thanksgiving, faith, and deliverance. And the amazing thing about this is, if we're honest, Jonah had done little to deserve God's favor. He'd run from him. He refused to pray and call out on his name in the middle of calamity. He had been disobedient. Yet at the point of Jonah's despair, at the point of him being figuratively, or literally I should say, in the belly of a fish, figuratively at probably his lowest point ever, he fully believes that God can and will deliver him. And Jonah closes out his prayer with this emphatic statement. He says, "Salvation belongs to the Lord." And what an awesome proclamation to make from the belly of a fish. He says, salvation belongs to the Lord. And even in the belly of this great fish, Jonah believes that God can save him. He says, salvation belongs to you, Lord, and you alone. And thinking back about where Jonah was, his cry out to God, and this declaration, what a great picture this is of the story of the salvation of God. For you and I, we probably have never been swallowed up by a fish. But we've all found ourselves at low points. We've all been like Jonah. We've all run from God. We've all turned our backs on God. We've all been disobedient in one way or another. But the amazing thing is that though we've been disobedient, though we've turned our backs on him, though we've flat out refused to do what he said to do, we've lived in separation from him. When we call out to the Lord, he will incline his ear to us and hear our call. And he saves us from the point of destruction. And he brings us to new life. So that's where we leave Jonah this evening. In the belly of a fish, uttering this prayer. And at the end of it, declaring that salvation belongs to the Lord. So as we close out this evening, I want you to reflect on two things. And the first is, what low places have you found yourself in calling out to God? It's important to remember Jonah's position right now. It's important to remember where he was, where he found himself at, and when he found himself at this place, his reaction. Because the rest of the story plays into this in one way or another, which we're going to find out over the next 2 weeks. Second thing, in the middle of chaos and uncertainty, can you have faith like Jonah, believing that God can and will deliver you? It's easy to have faith whenever things are looking good. It's easy to believe that God will save us whenever we don't have problems. But Jonah found himself in a great problem. He was in the belly of this whale. It didn't look good for him. Even if he got out of the fish's belly, he's in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, this vast sea. But Jonah didn't care about all that. In the middle of the fish's belly, he cries out to the Lord and believes that he can and will deliver him and bring new life to him. So this evening, I hope you dwell on those two things over the next weekend, to consider these things in your personal time and your times of meditation with the Lord. So as we close out this evening, I just want to let you know, if you have any questions about what we talked about this evening, you have any questions about God, questions about our church, if you send an email to the email address below, we'd be happy to get back with you and answer any questions you may have. If you go to the link below, well, you can find out ways to get plugged into our church. We'd love to have you come and connect with the people of our church, with what God is doing at our church. And the best way to do that is, if you don't contact us on Facebook, you can go to that form below and fill out a few things that you're interested in. We'd be happy to find a way to get you plugged in to our church. Follow us on our social media platforms to stay up to date with what is happening at Good Ground Church. And if you're ever in the area, just want to visit sometime, 5173 Lincoln Way West, St. Thomas, PA. We'd love to have you come and join us for church. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week on Breaking Ground. God bless.